It's our water rate study involving council and staff, and we're glad that you're all here tonight. Announcements? Mr. Foggin, before we get started, for anything?
Just probably a pledge.
We should do the Pledge of Allegiance? Okay, let's do that. And I will lead us in that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, we will turn the time over to Mr. Foggin and staff.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to participate with you in a workshop. We wanted to spend a little extra time talking about water rates, and I just wanted, before we kind of jump into this, wanted to share where we've been with water rates, and then I will turn it over to Tina to introduce our guest and have her and our guest walk you through what we've come up with. So back in 2010 is our last rate increase, and then in 2012 the city, for one reason or another, not exactly sure why, took a rate decrease. And fast forward to 2018, we actually started this water rate study. It got sidetracked a little bit. We went back to sharpened our pencils and kind of went back and redid it. And then we were ready to roll it out to the council in 2020. And everybody knows what happened in 2020. There was no appetite to talk about anything other than pandemic. And so this rate increase has been looming since 2018. We've known we've needed it. One of the things that I would say to the council, and just as a reminder, is that we were able to wait this long because we've been living off of retained earnings, and really that has gotten to a point where we're dangerously low in our reserves for water. And so it's absolutely critical. We're in critical mode now to where we've got to start marching forward with an increase. Now, I want you all to know that we've spent a lot of time talking about this, and what we have to share with you is basically a rollout of rate increases over a 5-year period. And we're proposing that rate increase over a 5-year period because we believe it's probably the easiest and most tolerable for our citizens and businesses. With what we're proposing, we will be able to run our water department, add money back into our reserves, and have a reserve by the end of 5 years that will be basically a 60-day reserve. That is a little bit short of what we're comfortable with, but in an effort to recognize that we should have had a rate increase a number of years ago, it seems fair to the rate payers. So that's kind of where we find ourselves today. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Tina, and she will take it from here.
You are.
Perfect. So thank you so much. Tonight we have with us Kevin Burnett, who's with Wilden Financial Services. He's been working with us since 2018. So he's very familiar with our water system and the history that we've been in so far in developing these rates. And at this time, I'm going to hand it over to him. We're going to tag team the presentation a little bit in the beginning, and then he'll take it on and provide you with the results and findings from the study. Kevin?
All right, thanks, Tina. As Tina said, I'm Kevin Burnett with Wilden Financial Services. I have been involved with the city and working on this project since 2018, and in fact, my time with the city goes back to that 2008 study that was previously done, but that was a former life, different company at that point in time. So very familiar with the city, as Tina said. So what we want to walk through with you tonight is I'm going to turn it over to Tina pretty quickly here to give you an overview of the water system, the customers, the funding, the rate structure, and then I'll take over again and walk through the purpose of the rate study, where we're at today, a summary of the proposed revenue increases that Mr. Foggin mentioned, the 5-year revenue increase projections. We'll talk about how that translates into rates, and then we'll give you some comparisons of how your current rates, your proposed rates would compare to your neighbors. So with that, I'll let Tina give you an overview.
Great. So a few council meetings ago, I provided you with a water system financial report and provided you with some customer data, some fund data, some rate structure data. And so I want to just recap over a couple slides looking at our customers and what we covered in that meeting. So our water system does currently have just over 22,200 customers, and most of those customers are residential, 93% of them. And we talked about the trends that we've been seeing over the last 10 years as far as consumption is concerned. Back in 2013, our residential customers were using about 6,800 gallons of water per month, and now they're just at about 5,800 gallons per month. I also shared that we serve customers not only inside the city limits, but outside the city limits. And although most of our customers are inside the city limits, we still have a decent number outside. 37% of them are outside the city limits. Now, we talked about, I had provided a slide a couple of, during that report, and shared that the overall commercial average consumption per month was at about 48,000 gallons. But we know that our commercial customers are very different. They have different usages. They have different usage patterns. They're different types: hotels, restaurants, manufacturing facilities, retail. And so I wanted to provide, and this was actually asked by Councilwoman Staley recently and wanted us to include this in here, which was a great idea, as far as looking at some averages and then looking at really some of those high users. And so when we look at our inside city limit commercial users, the average monthly consumption, and this does not include City of Kingman customers, the average monthly consumption is about 29,000 gallons per month, which seems pretty reasonable. But then when you look at some of those top users, our top 3 users inside the city limits, you'll see that it's pretty high. One of our hospital accounts, one of our apartment accounts, and our jail account use well over 1 million and over 2 million gallons per month. And then when we look at our outside city limit commercial users, we have some high users in that area as well. And so the average for them, again, seems reasonable at 19,000 gallons per month. But 2 of the school accounts use close to 500,000 gallons per month, and one of the college accounts uses just over 300,000 gallons per month. And then it's also important to point out our industrial park customers. We talked a little bit about industrial customers at our last meeting. And so there are about 100 industrial park customers. And again, there are different types of businesses out there. So on average, they use about 41,000 gallons per month. But our top user out there uses 1.2 million gallons per month. And then you see what the second and third top users are. And I do want to point out, just going back to the last slide, that inside the city limits, we have higher users than out at the industrial park. And so we also covered our current rate structure, as Mr. Foggin already covered where we were with rates back in the day. But we also have, so this particular study is covering our operating fund, which is the ongoing operations and maintenance of our system. It covers water operations, engineering, and the utility billing teams and all of the operations that they perform. And it's also covering the replacement or the renewal infrastructure of the fee that we charge, which is the capital renewal fund. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Kevin to talk about the purpose of the rate study and, again, the findings of the study.
All right. Thanks, Tina. So Mr. Foggin touched on the number one purpose of the rate study is looking at making sure we're generating the revenues that we need to cover our expenses. So that's providing for the funding of the current and future operating and maintenance expenses that Tina alluded to, as well as capital needs. And then the next bullet there, the meet minimum reserve level requirements. So we've got a 45-day target reserve projected through 2026, and then it would increase to 60 days. And where this becomes important is if we were living in a perfect world, the city would send out the bills to its customers, it would generate the revenue would get collected, and then Tina would pay her bills after the money was collected. That's not the world that we live in. There's always the mismatch between when revenues come in from our customers and when we have to pay our bills. So that 45 days or 60 days, as we're proposing to get to, provide some assurance that we're going to have money in the bank to be able to pay our bills and meet our obligations as they come due. The second piece that we're looking at is to develop rates which will generate the revenue sufficient to meet the cost of providing service. As Tina was just talking about, we've got a different customer mix. We've got some residential customers, we've got industrial customers, we've got commercial customers, irrigation customers. Each of those customers places a different demand on the system. It costs us, the city, a different amount of money to provide service to each of those different customer classes. So part of what we wanted to look at was look at our existing rates and making sure that we had that matching between what does it cost to serve the residential customers and what are we asking residential customers to pay through their rates. And then we also wanted to encourage conservation, which we've seen some of that happening already, but it's an ongoing issue and something that we were concerned about. So we wanted to make sure we address that as well. In terms of the current rate study process, so as has been mentioned, we started this back in 2018. It was put on hold for a little bit, and we're back in front of you again here. So staff has really taken a hard look, sharpened their pencils to make sure that they've identified the revenue needs that we need in order to fund the system, pay our operating costs, maintain the capital on the system side, making sure that they're as lean as they can be, that we've got the right matching between the revenue needs and the costs, and the cost savings have been found where they can be found. As I alluded to, we wanted to refine the existing rate structure to make sure it better aligned with the city's goals and had that matching between what does it cost to serve our customers and what are we charging them. So that relates to the residential, commercial, and irrigation classes there. Something that I wanted to point out, and this is something that we always like to talk about when we get to this stage of the rate study, a revenue increase versus a rate increase. They can be the same, but that's not always going to be the case, and you'll see that as we get a little bit further in the presentation. So as an example, when we look at what the revenue increase is, that tells us how much more revenue do we need to generate in order to operate the system. So we might decide that we need 10% more revenue overall to meet our costs going forward. That doesn't necessarily mean that every customer class is going to see a 10% increase. Based on the size of their meter, based on their monthly usage, a customer might see a 4% increase, a different customer might see a 12% increase. So there is a distinction between what the rate increase is and the revenue increase is. So you can't just make a blanket statement and say everybody's going to see a 10% increase. That's just not the case. We talked a little bit about this. Why are we looking for an increase in water revenue? The last study was done in 2008. Since that time, as Mr. Foggin alluded to, we've been living off our reserves. We're drawing down our reserves. You'll see in a couple of slides that we're still proposing to do that a little bit going forward. Costs have gone up. Inflation has been higher this past couple of years than it has been in a long time. That affects the city's water utility costs as well. Chemical costs are going up. Electricity costs are going up. The cost to replace water mains is going up. So without an increase, we can't maintain the system the way we need to. And then we've also got the targeted reserve levels that I was talking about, making sure we have that money to pay our bills. So this is the financial plan, the 5-year financial plan that has been put together this is the operating fund. So this is taking care of your chemical costs, salaries, going out and doing the meter reads, customer service, all those costs. So we're looking at fiscal year 22-23 where we're at today. We have no increase in this year, but starting next year, we've got a 20% cumulative, so 1.5% inflation adjustment, and then an additional revenue increase of 18.5%. So 20% total for next year, followed by a 17%, a 7%, a 5%, and then a 4% through 2028. So you can see on the chart at the bottom there, the dark blue bars are what our reserves should be. That's what we're targeting. And then the lighter blue bars is where we're at. So you can see even with those increases, we're not generating enough revenue to cover our costs in the early years, and we're continuing to draw down on that fund balance so that by the time we get to 2028, we've got that matching between the dark blue bar and the light blue bar of where we should be. So then the second component of the rates that Tina alluded to is the capital renewal fund. So again, we've got some rate increases that we're proposing on this end in order to rehabilitate, repair, maintain the system so that we're continuing to provide clean, safe drinking water going forward. So again, you can see with the increases we've got proposed there, so it's a 20% every year for the next 5 years. And we're still drawing down on that fund balance every year. So even again, with those rate increases, those revenue increases that we're showing there, we're still spending more than we're taking in, and we are drawing down that fund balance over time. We've got some of the capital improvement needs here. So this is the fiscal year 23 through 27. So you can see on the operating fund side, just shy of $1 million, $985,000 over that 5-year period. And then on the capital renewal fund side, we're looking at $15 million over the 5 years there. So some fairly significant reinvestment in the system, which is one of those things where it looks like a big number. It is a big number, but at the same time, if you don't do that maintenance now, I'm sure Rob and Phil can tell you, if you delay the maintenance and then something happens, you have a water main break, it's usually much more expensive to fix it at the time rather than be more proactive and setting the money aside and do it more prudently as we've got developed here. We've got some proposed changes that we're making to the rate structure. So this is getting into that cost of service piece that I was talking about, the matching between the costs and the revenues that we're charging each customer. So right now your base charge is the same regardless of meter size. So if you have a 3/4 inch meter, you pay the same rate as if you have a 6-inch meter. That goes a little bit against what the industry trend is. The industry trend is the larger the meter size you have, the higher monthly base charge you should pay. The theory behind that being is that larger meters have the greater potential to put more water through the meters. There's more capacity associated with a larger meter. There's a cost to that excess capacity or additional capacity. It costs more to buy a larger meter than it does to buy a smaller meter. So based on the costs associated with that, we're making a recommendation that you change to a meter-based base charge, and we'll get into that in a little bit. On the residential side, we're looking at revising 4 tiers, so we're going to include a lifeline rate. So that would be the first tier at a lower rate so that it provides lifeline water use to lower income or fixed income customers, giving them a little bit of a break there. On the commercial side, we're proposing to continue with the uniform rate, and on the irrigation, we're proposing to switch from the current 2 tiers to a uniform rate. And again, this is something that's becoming more common in the industry. Tina did a lot of research on this, and it's all over the board in terms of who has a uniform rate versus a tiered rate and how many tiers. The difficulty on the commercial side is something that we touched on a little bit earlier in Tina's slide. So you can imagine within your commercial customer class, you could have a small bookstore with just an employee bathroom in it. The commercial class also has the hospital in it. So if you're trying to develop a rate structure that's reasonable for the hospital and 2 tiers that make sense for the hospital, that small bookstore is never going to get out of tier 1 just based on the amount of water that you would have with the hospital. The same thing would be vice versa. If you're trying to set up a tiered rate structure that makes sense for that small bookstore, the hospital is going to blow through tier 1 and have all their usage in tier 2. So because of the diversity within the commercial class, that's why we're recommending the uniform rate. The same thing on the irrigation side. You've got the public schools that are watering their fields, so to try and develop a 2-tiered rate structure for the irrigation class, you're going to get a smaller irrigation customer that's never going to get out of tier 1 if it's designed for the public schools, and vice versa. Again, if you design it for a smaller customer, then the schools are always going to be in tier 2 on their irrigation rates. So,
Can I ask a question?
yes.
On that irrigation, you said you're proposing to move from a two-tier to a uniform rate.
Yes.
Is that an increase for some and a decrease for some, or how is that going to average out?
It will. It's going to be an increase for some, and it's going to be a decrease for some as well.
Okay.
So we'll get there in a
Okay.
few slides. So if
Thank
I
you.
don't address it properly, let me know and I'll try again.
Perfect, thank you.
So here are the monthly base charges. So as I mentioned, your current rate structure, so inside city and outside city, it's the same whether you're a 5/8 inch meter or a 6-inch meter. So we're proposing some increases there. So based on the meter size, and this is based on the amount of water that can go through each of these meters. AWWA, American Water Works Association, publishes a manual that says this is the gallons per minute for a 5/8 inch meter. This is the gallons per minute for a 4-inch meter. So we use those ratios to develop the differentials between the meter sizes here.
If I can just chime in real fast, Kevin. So if you recall, when we talked about this a few council meetings ago, we talked about how 70% of our revenues are currently collected through the volume rate. And with customers trending downwards, we wanted to try to increase those base rates so that we had definitely an amount of revenue coming in that we could rely on every month. So that's one of the purposes behind this.
Yeah, I said I'd be quiet, but I can't. Sorry. It's really important that we make sure that everybody understands base rate versus volume rate. And because I know that there's folks that you'll run into that will be confused by this. And so I just want to make sure that you're tracking along with what Kevin is going to be talking about. And the size of the meter is really, really important. And one of the things that I've always been surprised about by our water rates is that 3/8, 3/4, 1-inch, 6-inch meter is all charged the same amount. Because that demand that the 6-inch meter puts on the system is dramatically higher than what a residential standard meter is on the system. So that basically says that we have to have water in the system, that when that 6-inch water meter opens up full, that there's enough water to meet the demand going through that meter. You can imagine, and Phil can tell you what that number is, I can't, but it is dramatically different amounts of water that will go through one versus the other. That demand, that fixed rate is extremely important, but it is often something that people do not understand. Citizens will not generally understand this fixed rate amount. That is the privilege to be tied and connected to the system. If no water runs through that meter, you still will owe the city, in this case, $7.21.
Right
Okay?
now.
Right now,
Currently.
right. If you don't run any water through your meter, that fixed rate amount. But that is the amount that's extremely important to run our system, to make sure that there's water in the system ready to go through your meter. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands we're talking about two different things. One is the privilege of being connected to a water system. The other is the water that is delivered to the resident or to the building or to the irrigation customer.
So, and I just wanted to, I wanted to make sure that I did understand it, because Councilor Staley and I wanted to consider a tiered rate for usage. So
Correct.
in an effort to mitigate that, you are looking at this on a more consistent basis to mitigate those volume users.
So what you're seeing here is we will have a tiered rate proposal for our residential customers. That will be above and beyond what it costs just to be tied to the system.
Okay.
Okay?
Mhm.
So
Thank you.
a lot of times, I don't want to lose anybody in this because there is confusion there.
So
Right.
this is a consistent monthly revenue stream, whereas the other is a usage which can ebb and flow.
Right.
No
and
pun intended.
Well, it is intended because as we encourage conservation, the amount of water that gets used, the less gets used, the less we have to pay bills. So this piece of what we're doing has to stay consistent so that we can continue to make sure the system is operational and that bills go out and all that goes with that.
Thank you.
Once again, I think you said it, Ron, is the fact that this is just for having the privilege of having a water meter, basically, to help cover that cost. Correct. Then, just quick question for either, throw it out there. What are most of our meters, what size are most of our meters in the city for residential? Are they 3/4, 5/8?
They're 5/8.
Are they 5/8? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so just to continue with this discussion just a little bit further, if you look at a typical water system, 80 to 90% of your costs of the system are going to be fixed. So the cost to put the infrastructure in the ground, the cost to acquire water, the variable component would be chemicals based on the amount of water that's being treated, the electricity charges to do the pumping of that type of thing. So as Mr. Foggin mentioned, this is really a readiness to serve charge, this monthly charge, regardless of how much water you use. Again, if we look at the perfect world, in Tina's world, if 80 to 90% of our costs are fixed, then we would want to recover 80 to 90% of our costs through this base charge. The base charges that we've got here represent about 45% of what our revenue needs are, because you get a little bit of a butting heads, if you will. If we were to put 80 to 90% of our revenue recovery into this monthly base charge, it doesn't send much of a conservation signal on the volume side. If you're only getting 10% of your revenue from the flow rate, you really don't have any incentive to go from 6,000 gallons a month down to 5,000 or 4,000. Most of your bill's already being eaten up by this monthly base charge. So that's why we're trying to do that little bit of a balancing act there of not doing 90% from the base charge. The other aspect of it is if we're getting 90% of our revenue from the base charge, those customers that have very little water use are going to be paying a lot more as compared to the hospital with the 2 million gallons a month. Their monthly bill isn't going to be very drastically different just because we would only be getting 10% of the revenue from that volume charge. So that's a little bit of a balancing act that we're trying to do there.
Mr. Burnett, if
Yes.
I may, and you're talking a little quick for me.
Okay, sorry.
So our water system is currently not at 80 to 90% fixed cost, but other cities do implement something like that?
In terms of what the actual costs for your system are?
Yes, for
It's
your
an,
revenue.
it's an industry standard that most water utilities fixed costs represent about 80 to 90% of the annual costs. So Kingman would fall into that
Currently or,
currently, yes.
okay. But it sounds like these rates are going to change over time to where it's only 45% of our revenue is coming from fixed costs? Or did I mishear you? I might have misheard.
So yes, you heard correctly. We're
Okay.
just kind of, they're two separate pieces. So your actual costs of operating the system are 80 to 90% fixed. So that's going to stay the same regardless of what rate structure option we take. Our proposal is to recover 45% of the revenue needs from the monthly base charge, as opposed to going to 90% revenue recovery from the base charge. So the costs are still going to be 80 to 90% fixed. It's just how we're going to generate the revenue is what we're proposing to change.
Okay, thank you.
So then we've got the usage rates here. So again, as we've been talking about, so we've got the tiered approach that we're looking at for residential. So we've got a new tier 1 that's going from 0 to 3,500. So that's that lifeline rate that we were talking about. Your current rate structure, it goes 0 to 10,000 gallons, 11 to 45,000 gallons, and then greater than 45,000 gallons. So based on the fact that it is a tiered rate structure, there is some conservation incentive based on the fact that there are multiple tiers, and that as you progress through those tiers, you pay an incrementally higher amount for your water use. With that being said, the way the current tiers are, the 11 to 45,000 and over to 45,000, those are very generous tier thresholds. So you can get a lot of water within the first 2 tiers under the current rate structure. So we wanted to tighten that up a little bit. So we've got that 0 to 3,500 as a lifeline rate. Again, so the benefit of the low income or fixed income people. And then we've got 3,500 to 8,000. So at the 8,000 mark, we're capturing the average water use is about 6,000 gallons a month. So we're a little bit above the average in the first 2 tiers there. That's generally accepted to be a reasonable amount to wash dishes, do your laundry, take care of, showering, domestic water use. Once we get into tier 3, the 8,000 to 20,000 gallons, that's more discretionary water use, washing your car, irrigating your lawn, taking care of some of those items, and then over 20,000 gallons as the upper tier there. Yep.
It's Barnett, correct?
Yep.
Mr. Barnett, do you have what our current usage rates are in your packet here?
So they're down in the footnotes at the bottom there.
Okay.
It was a little messy to try and, because changing tiers, so.
And just the one question I want to highlight and making sure I understand this correctly is that the lowest usage rate right now will actually slightly increase by no more than a dime by fiscal year 27-28. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. I'll have a follow-up question
Okay.
later on. Thank you.
Sure. And then we've got the commercial. So again, as we said, we're proposing to keep the uniform rate on commercial. And then on the irrigation side, we're proposing to go to the uniform rate as well. So you can see on footnote 2 there, so your current irrigation tiers, you've got 0 to 200,000 gallons is at $2.42 a thousand, and then over 200,000 gallons at $3.64. So then we've got the uniform rate is going to be a little bit higher. So again, that's that realignment that we were talking about before of how much does it cost to serve each customer class and making sure that we're reflecting that in the rates themselves. The capital renewal fee, so much like the monthly base charge on the operation side, it's a uniform rate right now regardless of meter size. For the same reasons we talked about on the operating side, why we were recommending increasing it based on meter size, the capacity issues. So we've got our recommendations there. And then getting into some customer impacts. So we've got a low volume user at 3,000 gallons, an average customer at 6,000 gallons, and a high at 25,000 gallons. So you can see what their current bill is today and the proposed, and then the difference for fiscal year 24, and then what the percentage increase in their bills would be in 25, 26, 27, and 28. So one of the things that I will point out here is we talked a lot about the base charge and trying to recover that 45% from the base charge. So that's an increase from where you're at today in terms of revenue recovery from the base charge, which again goes back to the earlier comment I made. The more you're getting from the base charge, the less you're getting from the volume rate. So the volume rates don't go up as much as they otherwise would because we're recovering more revenue from the base charge. So what that means is you'll see the low volume user there would see a $5 a month increase. And then once you get into the high volume user, the 25,000, while they are seeing an increase, it's not as significant in their bill as the lower volume user. So it's that balancing act of making sure that we have enough revenue coming in to take care of the expenses that we have and then how we're going to recover that revenue. So then we've got some commercial customer impacts. So we've got the hospital, the jail, another hospital. So again, you can see based on the amount of water usage that they have and the size of meter that they have, they're seeing different increases overall. With the office retail at 118% increase, down to the hospital at 28.9% increase. One of the things that we did notice as we were looking at this, that office retail using 4,000 gallons a month with a 2-inch meter, you do not need a 2-inch meter for 4,000 gallons a month. So in my opinion, based on the work that I've done, they've got an oversized meter for their specific use.
And I do want to point out that we often run into folks that are designing commercial properties where their consultants that are doing the work will do the calculations based on if every possible water fixture is running full blast. And then that's how, and I know they do that for power too, and it ends up costing them a lot more. So this will hopefully encourage folks that are designing and putting buildings up to look at their water meter and really size it correctly. Just because, when you have a commercial customer who is using less than the average residential customer and they have a 2-inch meter, that just does not make a lot of sense for them. The other piece that I would point out on our commercial versus residential is our rates, as they have been over the last 12, 13 years, have been supplemented by our residential rates. So our commercial customers have not paid as much as they should have been paying, and residential was paying a little bit more than they should have been paying. So one of the things that this study does is balance. We've been talking about balance, but this really does balance the share of who's paying what. So commercial pays for their amount, and residential ends up paying what they should be paying. So,
Vice Mayor, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. I just, in the way that we do things, when we receive those development plans for a project, do we ever let them know? Or, I mean, is that a practice to let them know that they're overcompensating for?
So sometimes we'll notice that something's way off, right? And we will note and say, are you sure you want this? And ultimately, we'll leave the decision to them to make the choice. But there have been times where we've kind of questioned it and say, just want to make sure this is what you're asking for. And so, yes, there are times where we'll question it and give them a heads up.
I just think it would be best practice, because that user is going to pay that fixed monthly for the time that they own the property, or so if we could encourage them for those reasons, maybe it would help, because that office retail is tough to swallow. That's a huge increase.
Well, and under the old or the current rates, there's no incentive for them to change.
Right.
But there is now. So is that something obvious, like being proactive? Our engineering department, maybe we can point that out. This is going to save you money. Of course, you have to be careful because.
Yeah, we
I
can't
know.
direct them I mean, ultimately, they know what their use is going to be,
Right.
and they need to make that decision. But like I said, if we see something that looks way out of place, we'll say something.
And then we have a similar slide. So this is the irrigation customers. So again, this goes back to that revenue increase versus a rate increase. So if you remember, it was a 20% roughly increase in revenue that we needed, but you're seeing the actual rate impact or rate increase to the customers differs based on the size of their meter and the amount of water use that they're using on a monthly basis. So moving into some comparison to neighbors. So this is something that we always get asked. Everybody wants to know, how do we compare to our neighbors? It's one of the most difficult slides for us to put together, just because what we've done here is we've designed rates and a financial plan specific to Kingman. We weren't designing rates for Bullhead City or Prescott Valley or Prescott. So the capital needs in Kingman are going to be different than the capital needs in Prescott. The customer distribution, the customer makeup is going to be different in Kingman than it is in Flagstaff. But at the end of the day, everybody likes to know how we compare to our neighbors. So you can see where Kingman is currently at the 22.54, and then with the proposed rate increase for next year, it would go up to 26.61. With that being said, We're working in Lake Havasu City right now, so their rates are going to be going up. They're undergoing a rate study right now. Bullhead City, I'm sure you know, just recently took over the old EPCOR system. As part of that, they've discovered that they need more revenue in order to maintain the system, so their rates are going to be going up as well. The other ones didn't tell us their rates were going to be changing at all, so, but at least 2 of them are going to be changing from where we're at on this slide today.
And Kevin's being really nice. The numbers really mean nothing. It really, if you have 100 water systems, there's 100 differences that are not comparable. So they're all fruit, but none of them are apples to apple comparison. It's just a fun FYI, because the cost to deliver water for us and how we deliver that water is dramatically different than any of these other folks. And so it's just nice to know where we are, because our citizens and our businesses need water, and whatever that cost is to get them water is what it has to be, so.
Sorry, what's the red line for?
That's the average, sorry, I should have pointed that out.
Just the mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So then we also developed some alternative rate options for your consideration. So as Mr. Foggen mentioned, the way the current rate structure is right now, the commercial and irrigation classes are being subsidized by the residential class. That's why you saw those big increases in the commercial and irrigation comparisons. So one of the thoughts that we looked at was, what if we looked at phasing in the impact to commercial and irrigation customers? We didn't modify the residential rate structure as quickly as in our proposed or recommended rates, so that we limit the burden or lessen the burden to the commercial and irrigation customer classes. So this is our approach here. So we don't have quite the drastic increase in year 1 for the commercial and irrigation class. By the time we get to 25, 26, so we looked at a 3-year phase in so that the rates would be where they should be by 25, 26, but it was a step up through 23, 24, and then another step up in 24, 25 to ultimately get to where we needed to be in 25, 26. So that was an option that we put together for your consideration. And then another option that we looked at was to maintain that tiered rate structure for both for irrigation, and then switch from the current uniform rate for commercial to a tiered rate structure for commercial. So the thought process behind that is, normally when you're developing residential rates, that tier 1 rate is the indoor or domestic water use that I was talking about, the showering, the washing clothes, doing dishes, that kind of thing. So on the commercial side, we looked at, okay, what is the same methodology, looking at what would be domestic use for a commercial. And domestic use on the residential side is usually your average winter consumption, your November, December, January, or December, January, February, when you're not irrigating, so that most of the water use is for indoor water use. So we looked at the December, January, February water use for commercial, and the average was 22,000 gallons a month. So for purposes of this tiered rate structure, we said, let's make tier 1 for commercial 22,000 a month, and then tier 2 is going to be everything over 22,000 a month. Now, what I said before is still going to apply. You're still going to have that mismatch between the hospital. They're going to blow through the 22,000 gallons a month, and they're always going to be in tier 2. The small bookstore, probably not going to get to 22,000 gallons a month, so they're going to stay within tier 1 the entire time. On the irrigation side, we looked at what's the average water use across the entire year, and the average water use across all customers was 90,000 gallons a month. So when we looked at the bills further and said, okay, if we set tier 1 at 90,000 gallons a month, how much water over the course of the year is going to fall into tier 1? And it was about 10%. So we said a 10% tier 1 just does not make any sense from a rate structure standpoint. So we'll double it to 180,000 and say we'll give you 180,000 gallons a month. So that got us about 25% of water use would fall into tier 1, 75% fall into tier 2. again, going back to what I said earlier, where you've got the schools that are going to be using a lot of water, so they would blow through that 180,000 gallons most of the time, and they would be in tier 2, and then you would have smaller irrigation customers would never get out of tier 1. So that's what we've got developed there. It's another option for your consideration.
Hi.
Hi, Mr. Burnett.
Hi.
Question.
Yes.
How does this study differentiate between irrigation water and usable water? I mean, it all comes from the same water main. Can you explain that a little bit, please?
You're right. The water is the same regardless of whether it's being used inside or outside. Where we do get into the differences is in how the system itself is designed. So where, as I said before, in Tina's perfect world, she would have an 80 to 90% cost recovery, revenue recovery from her base charge. For Phil and Rob, they would love to design a system where everybody uses the same amount of water every day, the same amount of water every month, and they could size a system so that that nice average was used every single day, every single month. That's not the way the systems work. So you have to design the system so that it can handle the peak capacity in the summer months when everybody's doing their irrigation and that kind of thing. So the water itself is the same. Where we're getting into the cost differences is how the system has to be sized. So the irrigation customers that are using a lot more water in the summer than they are in the winter months, the system has to be sized to accommodate that, and there's a cost to operating the system that way. So that's how we're getting into the tier differentials in the costs.
I had a question about the commercial tiered system.
Mm-hmm.
So is there logic behind why it's only 2 tiers? Because like you said, it doesn't make sense for those smaller bookstore, retail outlets. Do we know how many of our users fall into that category, and is that even worth it? Can we get a smaller tier to accommodate those customers?
Yeah, so when we looked at it, so that tier 1 on the commercial side, it's also going to capture about 25% of your customers in there. We could certainly design as many tiers as you want. We could make a smaller first tier and add a second tier and a third tier. It's less common. Those rate structures are out there now. The gravitation is towards the uniform rate for the reasons that we've been discussing, but we certainly could.
I would just like to know how many of our users fall into that category. And, based off of those users, 25%. Okay. So 25% of our commercial customers fall into a category less than 22,000?
Correct.
Okay. So 25% of how many, Tina?
We've got about 2,000 commercial customers.
Okay.
So
Okay.
500.
70.
500.
So I can't speak for Counselor Staley because she's not here, but I know when I was looking at this, I was looking to capture that as far as, the way that the 2-tier works. It doesn't make any sense to even tier it out, basically. It really doesn't for those small users, but why would we harm those smaller users with a huge rate increase and not accommodate when I just feel strongly about accommodating that group of individuals.
So I want to jump in there and just say that any more tiering or the tiered system, again, we're not recommending a tiered system, but any tiered system is basically you're basically putting more cost on the big users that have, and that goes back to the conservation concept of tiers. And tiers are designed to encourage people to conserve. In the commercial side, as you can start seeing from either the irrigation customers or our big users in the commercial side, they really have no ability to reduce their usage. So any adopted tiered system is basically you're telling everybody in your commercial rate structure that because you use more water, you're going to pay more for your water than someone with that's using 22,000 gallons or less. And they have no ability in the examples that have up here, is that they have no ability to reduce or conserve to get into a different tier. They need what they need. And that's pretty much how the commercial rates work. That is why, as a best practice, most systems are moving away from a tiered commercial system, because it just costs what it costs to provide the water, and they're going to use the water that they need to put their business on.
And I understand that, but I just don't want to harm our mom and pops with the increase. I mean, we have a residential rate for, what did you call it?
Lifeline.
Lifeline. So, you know, I mean, you've got those mom and pops out there that are paying the same as the school, or it's just, it's a comment, and I just want it to be heard. Thank you.
Well, and again, that's why I also wanted to point out base rate versus water usage rate, because those mom and pop businesses are going to have a 1-inch meter versus these big users are going to have 4-inch. That system demand is really where the big commercial are going to pay versus the little small shops.
I need to do a go back. So the 2,000 customers includes our irrigation. We have about 1,500 just commercial customers, so it would affect about 375 customers.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Tina, when you say irrigation, do they actually have separate meters just for their irrigation systems?
They do.
Okay, and that's what I was thinking they did, but I wanted to confirm that.
Yep.
Okay.
The irrigation customers also include our construction, our fire hydrants, so the construction,
Oh, yes.
the construction
Part of
usage
the
as well.
portable meters or whatever you
Yes.
want to call them.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, so then as another point of comparison, so this is the same customer impacts that we saw for commercial customers, but this is laying out side by side the current monthly bill, the proposed monthly bill under our recommended option, and then if we went with the phase-in and then with the tiered phase-in. So you can see how it would impact each of those different customers. And then we did the same thing for the irrigation customers. So the current, what we've got proposed and recommended, and then the phase-in, and then a tiered phase-in. So then that brings me to the end of our presentation here. Certainly if there's additional questions, I'm happy to address them, but the next steps that we've got are to adopt the notice of intent and set the public hearing date, which the notice of intent is contemplated for next week, and then have the public hearing and adopt new rates. So, sorry, I didn't mean to dismiss your hand up there.
Please, it happens all the time. It's fine. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around a couple of concepts. So you're explaining to council today that 80 to 90% of our water revenue in our enterprise fund come from fixed costs or rates, or is that incorrect? That is correct. And we're trying to move this to 45.
Oh, no.
Do I have it backwards or something? Okay.
Go ahead.
So your current system costs are about 80% fixed. So that's what it costs to operate the system. 80 to 90% of your cost to operate the system are fixed. Right now, you're not getting 80 to 90% of your revenue from the base charge. You're getting much less. It's around 20%, I want to say. I'll have to go back and double check on that. About 30, okay, Tina says about 30%. So we're proposing to increase the fixed charge revenue from 30% to 45%.
So I tend to find increasing the fixed charges, or the base rates, I believe is what you call them, under both the operating fund and the Capinu renewal fund, the most fair to everyone. But Mr. Burnett, you're advising council that when you focus too much on the baseline or base rates, that it doesn't create incentives for customers to conserve water. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. The problem that I'm having is that when I'm looking at this tiered system, the customers that are now on the lifeline rate, they're still seeing increases, albeit over the course of, 4 to 5 years, they're still seeing an ultimate increase. At first, it'll be a slight decrease, but an ultimate increase in about 10 cents. And then for what I consider, I guess, an average user, because we're having about 6,000 gallons of water use per month is the average. That's increasing over time. Our problem is coming from people decreasing their rate use where we're not generating enough revenue. But on the other hand, we're talking about, well, we want everyone to conserve. I just don't want to appear like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth here. And I'm not trying to sound flippant. I'm trying to be charitable to the position. I'm concerned that people's rates are going to get increased while they're continuing to save. And it seems like, well, instead increasing the base rate under the operating fund or capital renewal fund would actually be the most fair to people who are saving or conserving on water, or am I missing something?
No, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the difficult things to do. What you're describing especially comes into effect when you're looking at drought rates, where you've established a drought program, you've put in drought rates, whether it's a surcharge or whatever the case is. You're telling customers, we need you to cut back on water use, but because you're cutting back on water use, we're not making the revenues that we need, so we're going to raise your rates because you cut back on water use and did what we told you to do.
Yeah, I just personally can't stand for a position like that, because we're encouraging people to conserve, but then we're punishing them by increasing their personal residential rate. To me, it just seems to contradict itself, and I don't want to do that to our customers. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, is there a way to even out the base rates under the operating fund and capital renewal fund, so that the people who are conserving on the rates under $8,000 won't see an increase, or is that just a pipe dream?
We tried to do that somewhat. So one of the benefits of going to that, increasing the base charge based on meter size, is that it somewhat tempers what the increase would be to those smaller meters if we were to keep the existing rate structure and recover 45% of our revenue from that 5/8 inch, 3/4 inch meter charges would be significantly higher than what they're at today. So in part, we were trying to do exactly what you're describing there. The way to, I think, fully achieve what you're requesting would be to drop that 45% revenue recovery back to the 30% it is now, or even further below that to 25% or to 20%. That would shift more into the volume side, and we could recover that through the higher tiers and provide less impact to those smaller volume users. But at the same time, that's putting your revenue stability at risk. The 45 days is a pretty lean target to begin with. So if we were to do that, that's that competing objectives, the butting heads that we were talking about earlier, where we're trying to do a delicate balancing act here. So certainly understand where you're coming from, though.
No, and I just needed that clarification from you to better understand it, and why even the lower usage residential customers will be seeing an increase, because in some, it sounds like there's really no way to stay on par with your revenue and costs without slightly increasing it, albeit reluctantly, upon those smaller or less intensive residential users.
Correct.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
I have a couple questions. What sewage rates, is this factored into this at all? This is just pure water. So someone that's got a septic tank is going to get the water rate increase, but they're not going to charge sewage. Okay. Second, on the capital renewal fee, from 2024 to 2028, there's a 100% increase. Is that needed?
Do you want to go to the capital projects, Kevin?
Whoops. You're talking about the capital renewal fee?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so in order to fund capital projects, we need to increase the rates.
Got it. And of course, those capital improvement projects are just costing us more because of inflation and all those other costs that are mounting up right now.
Correct. And Rob, just a couple of meetings ago, shared the issues that we're having with our distribution lines and our service lines especially. And so those are really the projects that are on the list, the main projects, those and the automated meter reading project in the out years. Those are really the projects.
Yes. Okay.
I think I already know the answer to this question because water rates are an enterprise fund. That means that any capital improvement projects to the water system, like water tanks or what's listed here, compact backhoe and loader, they have to be paid out of by, essentially by the customers, and they can't be subsidized through the general fund, is my understanding. Is that right? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions from council? Or Mr. Burnett?
Sorry,
Mr.
I'm not,
Pat? Yes.
I'm
No, you're
not
good.
disappointed. I'm disappointed with the reality, not with the presentation. I just want to make that clear. I appreciate the presentation, the explanation. You two have done a wonderful job, but I just feel very sad for our residential customers at the lower, and I just don't want to add a detriment to them if there's any way to reasonably avoid it. And I understand sometimes there aren't reasonable maneuvers that we could take to avoid such of them incurring a cost.
Well, and I would say that is the heartbreak of not having a better process and plan for look at visiting rates. Because had we been visiting rates over time, doing this as best practice, then we wouldn't be in this position today. 5 years from now, you will feel better about what we're talking about for our lower use residents, lower use water residents, because we've got the rates adjusted correctly. But this is a big pill to swallow for everybody. I mean, no one wants to talk about this. And you would avoid it as much as you can, but that's irresponsible, and we've not done our customers any favor by waiting as long as we have. So you're speaking exactly the same way we felt as we've looked at these numbers, and we've worked with them and massaged them. Again, I want to say getting the base rate to where it needs to be is extremely important, and maintaining that base rate over time is really important. The complaint that you will get and the complaint that we will get is for those people, it's not even the low users, it's the people that are here half the year, or they go on vacation for 2 months or 3 months. They will still get a water bill, and it will be that base rate that will show up, and they will be mad because they didn't use no water flowed through their meter. And it's really not even the low user water users that will be upset. It's those people that run no water through their meter. Just like I said, the privilege of being hooked to the water system. So.
And I think it's important, as has been mentioned, the last rate increase was in January of 2011. 12 years later, and now we're actually sort of playing catch up now a little bit, and we're having to go back and say, hey, we need these monies. It would have been great, yes, if we would have done it like every 2 years or some kind of adjustment. It might have been a softer impact. But the reality of it is, what is our inflation rate, our CPI have been since 2011. So we're actually playing catch up now, and we have to. But it hurts, though, to have to raise rates. Yeah.
In your professional opinion, what do you see as best practice? You see phased-in rates, or you just see the other option? What do you see more of?
So it depends. I'll give you a consultant answer. If you were doing the best practices, as Mr. Foggin alluded to and the mayor alluded to, where if you were looking at your rates every year, then you would adjust them annually and you wouldn't phase in, because they were, generally speaking, you're tracking with the changes in usage. When you get into that 8, 10, 12, 15-year period between formal rate studies, the usage patterns don't change overnight. They changed over the 8, 10, 12, 15 years. So in those cases, it's a fairly mixed bag, whether they just bite the bullet, for lack of a better term, and just do it all at once, or they do the phase-in period over time. The phase-in, in some respects, is, understandable, and you can appreciate, well, we got here over time, so we're going to get out of it over time. But at the same time, the flip side to the phase-in rates is that somebody's being subsidized, and you're perpetuating that subsidy for the next 3 years, 5 years, however many years you're going to phase in the rates. So there's the two different thoughts on it, that we want to rectify the subsidy right now versus it's too much of an impact to rectify it now, so we're okay continuing that subsidy, albeit at a lower level, for another 2 or 3 or 5 years.
How often are we going to, is it going to be proposed to do a rate study?
So we are going to work through this for the next 3 years. If we're still on track, we'll wait till that 5th year, or probably the 4th year, and start through another rate study. Really, I don't disagree with Kevin, but best practice for rates is to have a CPI, an index built into your rates, and then look at it every 3 years is my preference. Because if you build in the inflationary rate into the 2-3 year period, you're keeping up with inflation. And so when you do your rate study, you're generally not way out of whack. And that, for me, is the way I would prefer to move forward with this. That is not currently what we're proposing in these rates. Is we do take in account inflation. But we will more than likely look at we'll definitely look at where we are in year 3 to make sure that we're meeting these goals, because with a reserve at 45 days and even 60 days, it really should be 90 days. If no money was coming into the water fund, can we run the water system, the most important system that we provide, period, is water? Can we run that water system without any revenue for 3 months? And the answer currently is no. We can run it for 45 days, and by the end of this, we can run it for 60 days. And so we're going to build up there, and we're going to get there, but we will look at these rates. We actually look at the rates every year when we go through the budget process, and if we're eating into retained earnings, then we're eating into it greater than we thought we were going to, or that we were planning on, that's probably a good indicator that we may be needing to look at rates sooner than later.
So either way council decides whether we do the phased-in approach or just the usage rate increase at that 3-year mark, are you confident in both scenarios?
I'm confident in both scenarios. I would not, again, we would not recommend that you just adopt a rate that would get you where you need to be in the 5-year period in 1 year.
I'm just weighing out the pros and cons to both scenarios so I
pro-
can make an informed decision.
Yeah, no, I totally understand why you're asking the question. It's, again, as Kevin pointed out, we waited way too long to raise rates. And so the penalty to us, to the system, is that we go into an increase over time to make that up.
So just looking at these different charts, the usage rates and the phase-in rate, your 0 to 3,500, 23, 24, actually it is more of an impact with the phase-in on that lower rate at $1.85 a gallon, right? As opposed to $1.48.
Correct.
And these are still cheaper than the current $1.93.
Correct.
So at least as far as a usage factor, it's actually going down.
Correct. Yep.
Right, we have to, right, which is a base cost, right. So, I mean, for example, Mr. Pat, talking about our lifeline users, through the, even if we adopt it, that it's only at $1.48, so it is, yeah, it's one way or the other, but at least we can point out that their usage rate, as opposed to the phase-in rate, is still cheaper going that way. And the rates are, the gallon per gallon rate is cheaper.
So is there no opportunity to phase in the base rate?
It was something that we discussed, but again, this is going back to that 45 days is very, very lean as it is, and making sure that we have that revenue stability. We didn't want to do any phase-in on the
Okay.
base charge or the capital renewal fee, because we need that guaranteed revenue source coming in.
So that would put us under the threshold?
It would.
Okay. All right, because I was just thinking maybe we could at year 2 or, so phase it in.
Right.
And
Or
once
a-
again,
or
we're playing
average out.
catch-up.
Yep.
Always.
Yeah, if we could have been raising it every 3 years, for example, adjusting it, it wouldn't be such a drastic
Yeah.
jump up. Okay.
I just have one question. On these, the customer impact by option, I see you have one for commercial and one for irrigation, but not one for average user.
Average user for,
The smaller, the regular tiered without the irrigation or the, just the normal bill that an average house would pay. You have hospital, jail, and all that, but you don't have anything residential. So is the residential,
yeah, so we've got the residential there, so we've got the low at 3,000, the average at 6,000, and a high at 25. It's slide 18. Is that what you were looking for?
I think
Okay.
Councilmember Ward was looking for the phase-in, what it looks like for the
Yeah, I didn't
residential
see that.
customers
Oh,
under the phase-in.
My mistake,
Yeah.
yes.
the customer impact by option was what I was looking at.
Mhm. Yeah, we don't have that.
No,
Okay.
you're right.
Okay, I missed that slide. Thank you.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much. Tina, of course. Appreciate all the work done on this and all of staff that has been working on this. I think we're done with questions.
Yes, thank you for the answers in the presentation.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think if nothing else, we can adjourn. Okay. Thanks all of you, and of course, once again, have a good evening.